Good morning and welcome. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank in Philadelphia. And I'd like to welcome you to our program this morning. It's the FPRI Wilson Center's Conference on the Belt and Road's Impact on Partner States. Before we get started, I'd first like to acknowledge our friends at the Wilson Center, starting with Shihoko Goko and the entire team for hosting us this morning. This is a spectacular conference setting, so thank you so much for that. I'd also like to thank FPRI's chair, Jacques Delisle, and the rest of the FPRI team for helping with this conference. We have a very good panelist lineup this morning, and I would like to briefly mention Dr. Nara Sritharan. She's not only one of the expert panelists, but she's one of our new Templeton Fellows at FPRI. She's a brilliant scholar, and we're really fortunate to have her with us. This conference has a lot of significance for us. It's been around for about 10 years. We were just comparing notes this morning, and it's been a very fruitful collaboration between the Wilson Center and FPRI, and so we're really grateful to have it continue on and hopefully for many years into the future. It's also, I might note, I came to FPRI in January 2020, and this is the first conference we've had in person since I arrived. I guess 2019 was the last time we had an in-person conference. So I think you're all aware, I don't need to go into great detail about the significance of the Belt and Road, and it's having a lot of influence and impact around the globe, and today we're here to talk about the impact on partner states. I'd also like to mention that we have a special issue of Orbis coming out this coming fall that will focus on different aspects of China's economic activity and will feature articles by all four of today's panelists. Orbis, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is FPRI's Journal of World Affairs, and it comes out quarterly. And I'm proud to say it's in every major library in the world. We also, in the last year and a half, have established a China Center within our Asia program at FPRI, and we are also concurrently establishing the Geoeconomics Initiative within our China Center. So that's an interesting side note to be aware of. We have a great set of panels this morning, and I am very pleased to be able to introduce this morning our first panel's moderator, Jacques Delisle, who's on my right. He's the Asia chair of the Asia program at FPRI. He's also the Stephen A. Cousin Professor of Law and Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, and the director of the University of Pennsylvania's Center for the Study of Contemporary China. As you'll see, he has deep expertise in all things China, including Chinese politics, China's engagement with the international order, and U.S.-China relationships. So thank you once again for joining us, and I'm going to turn the reins over to Jacques Delisle.
Well, thank you, Raleigh, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today in the room and out there on the webinar. As Raleigh said, this is the kind of transitional moment on the Asia program at FPRI. I'm stepping down as director and staying on as chair, and you'll be hearing more from our new director about upcoming events. The other thing I'll say is, in addition to the 4 papers that you will hear today, there will be 4 other articles on the same theme that will be in the special issue of Orbis, and we expect to be doing webinars with those writers to sort of essentially do what we're doing today, but do it entirely virtually, partly because those authors are scattered around the globe, and I'm grateful to the 4 who've shown up here. And I think the prize for the longest travel goes to Matt Erie, who's in from Singapore, with Matt Furch in a close second, who's in from Europe, and then others a bit more local. I also want to just reiterate Raleigh's thanks to the Wilson Center, and particularly to Shihoko Goto. Shihoko and I have been partners in this particular crime for a long time, and it's always great to cooperate with her and with the Wilson Center. So we're actually a bit ahead of schedule, but I hope that's going to be okay? Let's proceed, right. So I want to ask the first, the first two panelists to come up here so that you'll be on the webcam appropriately. So if Nara and Matt Furchin, that is, can come up here. Excuse me. And so the first panel we're going to focus on today is the impact on partner states, China's development promotion and foreign aid policies. I'll give our two speakers a brief introduction here. Nara Sritharan is a postdoctoral fellow at Aid Data, which is at the Global Research Institute at William & Mary, just not too far from here in Virginia. And as Raleigh mentioned, she's a 2023 Templeton Fellow at FPRI, so we're delighted to have her with us, and I think a lot of people in this room know Aid Data's data-driven work on development and development assistance and many other topics. Matt Furchin, to my immediate left here, is somebody I've had the pleasure of collaborating with in a number of undertakings recently, including this one and some things we've been doing at Penn. Matt is a senior fellow at the Leiden Asia Center in the Netherlands, and he is about to move, I can say this? Okay, to the Yale China Center, which is really one of the powerhouses in work on contemporary China now. He was for many years a professor of international relations at Tsinghua University in Beijing, one of China's leading universities, who was also a scholar at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. He was also the head of global China research at MERICS, the Mercator Institute for China Studies, which, as many people know, is one of the first victims of the recent wave of bannings from China. So, you know, he will have interesting things to say. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to our panelists to address the topics of this first panel. And I think it's a really interesting pair of papers. We have one paper, the one from Nara, which will be focusing on China's role as an aid donor and the way in which it is similar to or dissimilar to other providers of aid, primarily Western-dominated, I think it's fair to say, institutions like the World Bank, the ADB, and OECD countries. And then Matt will speak to the question of China's economically developmentalist foreign policy, which, as you all know, is increasingly viewed in the West as part of sort of political competition and many charges that China is using its economic leverage in coercive ways to political ends, and he'll speak to those issues as well as the intertwining of economic and security concerns in Chinese foreign policy. Then we'll turn to our later panel, which will focus essentially on China's exporting its ways in one form or another, whether it's legal models and legal ideas, its notion of the rule of law, which Matt Erie, whom I'm proud to claim as a former student, will speak to, and then we'll have Jonathan Solis and others speaking to China's export of digital censorship and other such things. So without further ado, let me turn it over. I think we'll just go in the order in which we appear on the agenda. So we'll turn it up first to Nara.
Okay, sure. I can start.
I'm sorry. Okay. So I suggest one other thing before we go, which is for those of you who are in the room when they finish their remarks, raise your hands. I'll recognize you. For those of you who are on the webinar, you can just put your questions in the box. And I see a couple messages already that the microphone's not picking this up. So that may be my failure to speak loudly enough, or it may be my failure to move the microphone close enough. I said nothing important. We're about to get to the important part, so I'll ask Nara to make sure the microphone is close and the button is down.
Let me know if people tell me that that it's not coming through the sound. I'm going to talk a little bit about Sri Lanka as a receiver, as a recipient of aid, especially in the post-conflict scenario of Sri Lanka. If you followed the news, you've heard about the Sri Lanka-China relations lately in the past year or so with the loan defaults, debt restructuring, and so on. Sri Lanka, similar to Pakistan, is kind of BRI darling, if you will, right? It's seen a lot of China's financial good graces in the last decade or so. In this particular research, I'm looking at 3 different donors in Sri Lanka, so it's a subnational aid study. I'm looking at the World Bank, I'm looking at Asian Development Bank, and then at China as well as a donor. And the data I'm using is aid data for China, and World Bank also for aid data is also for the World Bank, and then Asian Development Bank was data that I collected myself. And what I'm trying to gain some insight into in this paper is, does war-affected district, are they prioritized by donors in a post-conflict scenario? Does aid reach the districts that have been heavily affected by war once the war has ended? So that's the kind of research question that I'm diving into in this paper. Why did I pick Sri Lanka? Sri Lanka makes for a great case study for this particular purpose. The war, whether you know about it or not, it was a war along ethnic lines, linguistic lines, and religious lines. The war ended with kind of a winner-takes-all minority group completely eliminated, and there wasn't a peace agreement following the end of the war. So there was no way to address the underlying grievances that actually led to the war in the first place in the 80s, and also no way to address, no effort to address any of the grievances that occurred during the war. And another good reason for studying Sri Lanka is the war was contained into particular geographical areas. So it was predominantly, if you're familiar with the geography, the northeastern part of Sri Lanka was the part of the country that was most heavily affected by war. And that, for me, made it easy as a researcher to identify and say, this district was affected by war, this district was not affected by war. And lastly, the juiciest part, why we're all here, is China is a huge donor in Sri Lanka, and the way that China does their aid makes it for an interesting case study for this particular reason. Compared to donors like the World Bank or Asian Development Bank, DAC members in general, where they have conditionalities on human rights violations, they have conditionalities for economic performance, governance performance, and so on. China has little to no conditionalities on their aid in that way, which means that in the case of Sri Lanka, where ethnic grievances are still very much in place, and under normal circumstances where Western donors would have been the prominent people navigating this post-conflict scenario, would have attached conditionalities for the government to address war crimes and so on. Because the government of Sri Lanka chose to pivot more towards non-traditional donors like China, those issues have remained unresolved, and the ethnic grievances are still pretty high in the country. So what I do in this paper is through geospatial analysis and statistical analysis, I look at the 3 different donors and how they have allocated aid from 2010 until 2015. And what I find is that the World Bank is actually 4 times more likely to give aid to war-affected districts than any other district in the country. And another big takeaway is that, and that was not the case for Asian Development Bank or for China. And another big takeaway from the paper is that Chinese aid was 5 times more likely to find its way to the president's home district. And you might have guessed what that district is. That's Hambantota district, where the president at the time and the Rajapaksa family, their constituency, all of them are from there. It was a very underdeveloped place. It didn't have the potential to become what they might have wanted it to become. What we do know about this district is that it's a crucial part of China's Maritime Silk Road initiative. It is crucial, the Hambantota port is a crucial part of what analysts have coined like the string of pearls. According to aid data research, just in the Hambantota port, not even looking at the airport or any of the other mega infrastructural project that they undertook there, just looking at the port, they invested $2 billion into this project alone. So it is big, and it makes sense that district would pop off as being 5 times more likely to get aid from China than any other district in in Sri Lanka. So what can we, how Sri Lanka and China are aligned in terms of political alignment, if you will, is since 2010, Rajapaksa's regime was mainly focused on infrastructure development and trying to, their approach at the time was, let's try to develop the northern and eastern parts of the country with infrastructure and roads and so on. The people in those places will feel the economic benefits of this development, and that will make them come back into the country, and that was his approach to reconciliation. That worked very well in China, that type of approach. It's a huge country, China is large, and it worked very well for that particular, how they did it in China. It's a similar model that they've adapted in Sri Lanka, but that has failed. But they align very politically in that way, and because of Sri Lanka's geopolitical strategic position, just geographically speaking, and also so close to India, has made it very attractive for China to invest quite a bit in the country. And I am going to wrap this up. The main policy takeaway that I have from this research is that reconciliation didn't happen the way that it could have happened. That would probably require better cooperation between donors, local governments, activists, and grassroots organizations to better understand and assess which development projects, what kind of sectors should have been invested in for them to actually benefit from these large infrastructural projects that they did. And that these kinds of infrastructure-led economic development approach to reconciliation might not be very successful if they're not followed by some kind of political reconciliation as well, an effort to do that. So even though China is very, their approach to aid is the governments decide, we are going to stay out of it, we will give you the money, you decide how you're going to spend this money. However, if that's going to be, if that is their approach, and they're saying they're staying out of domestic politics, but the way that they're conducting their aid does affect domestic politics, and in the case of a post-war scenario like Sri Lanka, where the long-term sustainability and long-term peace, politically speaking, hinges on ethnic reconciliation, China might want to reassess how they do aid, and I believe it would be in their best interest to have recipient countries who are actually able to pay their loans back, and if a country is going back into war, that likelihood goes down. So I think my understanding is China is trying to reassess how they do aid, and that will be an interesting thing to follow up with research as it pans out. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, and I think we'll take questions after the second presentation. So Matt Furchin, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. And I think there'll be some elements of crossover here, so it's great to be here. I'm going to talk today about a paper that I titled Development as Magic Bullet, ? The implications of China's developmentalist foreign policy. So this actually is something that began as a project maybe almost 10 years ago. In my mind, I wrote something and gave a talk when I was still at Carnegie called Is China Too Liberal? To sort of incite discussion. I then wrote something a little bit more detailed called How New and Crafty is China's New Economic Statecraft? And this is kind of my effort to try to move forward with some of the issues that I explored in those discussions and papers. And really the core question for me is what are the implications of China's obsession with development? Maybe obsession's not exactly the right word, but I'll use that to get us started. So just to preview some of the takeaways here, and Jacques already mentioned this, right now we're hearing a lot of discussion about China's economic coercion, about punitive efforts, sticks. But for as important as that is, and as much attention as governments and businesses around the world are paying to that, China's core focus with its economic foreign policy is on inducements, on what it claims are, these win-win positive outcomes focused on development. And yet, since the beginning of its efforts my paper is really about going back to the beginning of the turn of the millennium, there have been problems with that preceding the BRI. This sort of focus and obsession on development as a cure-all is something that was there prior to the BRI. The BRI is infused with it. And as we look at further developments and adaptations, that developmentalist framework is going to continue to play a really large role. So I'll talk a little bit more about some of those details here. So the political economy of developmentalism. So there's a quote, I just love it. You can find all kinds of similar ones, but Wang Yi, the former foreign minister who just stepped down in 2019, he said, "Development is the master key to all problems." Let that soak in. That is something that is taken very seriously domestically and in terms of foreign policy. Domestically, this idea that development is a necessity has been in place and a key part of China's domestic governance, especially since the late 1970s, early 1980s. The idea that development and stability go hand in hand is a crucial element of domestic governance in China. Now, is that changing? Is Xi Jinping sort of replacing that scenario? We can talk about that, but it has been crucial for a very long time. Now, this has become also a key element of China's foreign policy, that development is necessary for peace and security, and that China offers this as, in its rhetoric, but also that there is a political economic logic to it, which is that more economic development opportunities, by which China generally means business, commerce, let's do deals. And that's what it is domestically a lot of the times too. And it's adapted over time, but development basically is equated with GDP growth or more business than less. So the idea of what development is and what China is offering to the world is also the proposition from China's side in terms of foreign policy has been that this is something that not only produces beneficial economic outcomes for China and its developing country partners in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, but that it's also good for China and that the outcomes are positive in terms of development and peace and security as well. So there's this hinge between the domestic and the international elements of this. And certainly you could just say, well, this is just propaganda, but there is a way in which it is sort of believed. It is part of an identity, and it is something that China will not give up easily, despite the flaws, some of which you just described, in this framing that sort of development is the master key to all problems. And one way to think about this is that it's got a similar kind of framing to the way the U.S. identity hinges on issues of democracy, freedom, and markets. So, there's elements of this which feed into rhetoric and propaganda, but it's also deeply believed and part of an identity. So there are elements of this developmentalism which predated the BRI, and I think there was an easy phase of China's developmentalist foreign economic policy from around 2003 to 2013, which corresponded with the commodity boom. So China really rolled out this idea of like, well, we're going to do business with these developing country regions, and I think Africa and Latin America, or South America, really fit the best for this, and it really corresponded with the commodity boom. China's there as a new purchaser of minerals, energy, agricultural products. It's good for everyone. China's there in the market. Oh, and by the way, that corresponds with a lot of diplomacy. And it's kind of interesting now as Lula's back in charge in Brazil, that Lula really oversaw this.
There, we heard that pick you up on.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. So this period of 2003 to around 2013, it was relatively easy for China to portray this as working well for everyone, despite the fact that there were quite a few problems in terms of concerns about dependency. There were growing concerns that there was a sort of lack of fairness. We were already seeing some of the loans being distributed, especially in places like Venezuela, that were creating problems. So even during this easy phase, there were quite a few holes you could poke in the questions about developmental outcomes, including China's investment in conflict regions, including in its own neighborhood in Myanmar, but also in places like Libya. There were lots of problems and challenges, and yet China forged ahead, including in the BRI. So that was the first paper I wrote was kind of like, well, everyone's excited about the BRI, including the sort of on the Chinese side, that's, oh, it's going to work great, but it's the same logic that supposedly development is going to deliver all of these great things, but there were going to be reproductions of some of the problems that we saw prior to the BRI infused into the BRI, and in fact, some of those were going to become even greater challenges because that easy phase prior to the BRI in 2003 to 2013 was largely based on trade. What you see afterwards then is FDI and finance, and that comes with all kinds of more political entanglements and difficulties. So a lot of these issues became sort of more infused into the BRI, issues that we are certainly aware of, environmental challenges, local problems with civil society, conflict regions, just lack of consulting with local communities. Debt sustainability obviously became one of those that was quite apparent early on, but again, sort of many of the debt sustainability issues we're talking about today are legacy issues that even predated the BRI. And then there's questions of the sort of informality, something I talk about in the paper and that I've written about. Basically, China's economy is very freewheeling in many ways. Its own domestic economy is been very, very much a Wild West economy. We hear a lot about state capitalism, but there is a lot of economic activity by smaller, non-state directed actors, especially in Southeast, South, Central Asia. And that can generate a lot of economic activity. It can also be extremely disruptive, and it's associated with China's influence. And we have seen instances where Chinese actors have taken it upon themselves to declare that their projects like gambling, casino projects, and entire special economic zones, that those are part of the BRI. There was an instance of this in Myanmar, for example. So this can be abused as well. Despite this, China has adapted. Over time, there has been there was a greater commitment to analyzing and managing political risk. Corporate social responsibility was something that we certainly heard a lot about in the pre-COVID years, that China was listening, hearing feedback from its developing country partners, but also from international criticism on the environment. We hear this on labor. And then in COVID, we see an adaptability as well, where China sort of pivoted and emphasized the health Silk Road and digital Silk Road elements of the BRI, in part to sort of maintain or show its commitment to its developing country partners, and it can frame these things as also commitments to development. So the idea of what constitutes development is quite flexible. So there is an adaptability and pragmatism to China's developmentalism, and yet is infused with various problems and challenges that China sometimes confronts, sometimes listens to a lot of these issues of conflict, investment in conflict regions. There was a lot of discussion about this in pre-COVID times when I was there in places like Myanmar and elsewhere, and yet how have those lessons been learned, what's been adapted? Big question marks there. What do we make of sort of China's commitment to developmentalism now? I think there are a couple key challenges and question marks around this. First of all, China has presented two new initiatives to sort of compete, well, maybe compete with the BRI or that potentially might replace it, the Global Development Initiative and the Global Security Initiative. So this is something I talk a little bit about in the paper. I don't think that either of these are going to temper or change or cause China to sort of step back from its commitment or its identity and its obsession with developmentalism. And I bring out a few quotes again from Wang Yi just before he stepped down in February about China's commitment to development and peaceful development. And Xi Jinping also has emphasized commitment to development, but also infused with a key portion of security, that security is increasingly on the mind of China's leaders in terms of what they think is the environment for their own development, for their engagement with developing countries. This idea that China is going to sort of trade out a commitment to economic growth or economic development in place of security, I think that is mistaken. I think that there will be a recalibration. I think that it's always been the case that Chinese leaders in both domestic and foreign policy see a connection between these two, and they're highly adaptable. What China means by development is highly adaptable. What China means by stability and security is highly adaptable. And I think, if anything, given the sort of insecurity in China's sense that interdependence is no longer something that it can count on in terms of trust with the West, that it's going to double down on developmentalism and development relations with what it considers to be other developing countries, in part because of security interests. Some of that will be on raw materials, but also for its other interests. So I think that what this means from a point of view of U.S. policy is at least paying attention to the fact that aside from the coercion stuff, there's a lot going on at the core of China's foreign economic policy related to this history of developmentalism. And as we sort of come out of this period where China's been isolated for a long time, it's going to be really interesting and important to see the directions it takes that. It's going to be highly adaptable, and for all the challenges, there is an appeal and a resonance in a lot of developing country regions, and you hear these sort of quotes that, well, China comes with the deal, the U.S. comes with a lecture. So where is that going to end up? And I think the U.S. needs to take that seriously. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you both. You've given us a lot to chew on there. There are several questions in the chat as well we'll be taking in the room. I'm going to abuse the privilege of the chair to ask a couple of things first. First of all, you've portrayed China as actually they're pretty good Marxists, right? I mean, the economics determines the rest. The politics will follow. I think that's a message from both of these. I wanted to ask Nara a couple of questions. One is, how big a threat is China's approach? Its sort of non-conditionality, its willingness to be to play the game of sending the money where a possibly not terribly appealing leader wanted to go. How big a threat is that to the agenda of Western aid donors, or by West I would here include sort of liberal democratic Asia, to try to influence what goes on in these states? I mean, is this really undermining, or are they just sort of peripheral still? And then the second question I ask you is in the Sri Lanka case, how much resonance do you see with China's concerns about its own ethno-nationalist problems? I mean, it's an ethnic split, and you don't have to scratch very hard in Chinese foreign policy to think about what does this mean for Tibet, what does it mean for Xinjiang, things like that. So if I can pose those two to you. Sure, go ahead. Yeah. We don't want to merve them too much.
Okay. So how big of a threat is China to the agenda of traditional donors? Was that kind of the question?
The attempt to do truth and reconciliation.
The
attempt to ameliorate some of these problems.
So this is my, I'll speak as, this is my opinion, right? I don't think it's that much of a threat. I think China and Western donors can actually work very well as, instead of thinking of them as substitutes, think of them as complements, maybe even. what China does do very well is these large infrastructural projects, which are in demand from developing countries, and I think that is something that they provide quickly and in a manner that is attractive to those developing countries. And I think where Western donors could potentially help more, and I understand there is a problem of, participating in aid transparency initiatives that makes it harder for traditional donors to coordinate their efforts around what China is doing, and that is probably the biggest challenge at this point. But I think there is a place where Western donors could complement what China is doing in terms of building out government capacities in a way such that governments themselves are able to see how they could spend the Chinese money better, if that makes sense. So that's my opinion on that. And yes, I do believe China has stayed out of the Sri Lankan war crimes and so on, particularly because of their own backyard issues. And if they were to force the Sri Lankan government to deal with war crimes, they would have to take, it comes off as hypocritical, and they would have to take a look at what's going on with themselves.
Okay, a couple of quick things for Matt, and then I welcome people to raise their hands in the room. So the one question, I guess, is I fully take your point that developmentalism runs through Chinese domestic and foreign policy. It's been a constant, and they're deeply intertwined. But is what would be the impact, if to the extent anything is occurring, of China's own model of development changing some? Right, we have a much more statist, very not a qualitative profound change, but clearly some changes at least around the edges, and many people would say pretty deep. So the Chinese model that's in a sense being exported here is itself changing. What effect does that have? And then the second question is where you would put BRI in the broader context of things like AIIB, the New Development Bank, and things like that, where those institutions so far have played by status quo rules, but they are, in a sense, institutional options for China if it wants to push this model harder. And then I promise I'll shut up and let other people ask questions.
Great. Yeah, I think this is an interesting game that China has played for quite a while, because China's own development model, even if you look back in those early commodity boom years, to me, this is structurally a North-South relationship. This is a country who's manufacturing, sending manufactured goods for raw materials, sending finance. I mean, this is the old model that has been criticized as a North-South relationship. So China for a long time has been able to say, well, we're a certain kind of developing country. We're at a certain stage of development, and you're at a certain stage, and that's good for you. And that's why I think my China too liberal thing, like, well, that's okay, you can say this. This is basically a comparative advantage argument. Now they can push forward with industrial policy, which is not a lot of, it's not new, maybe there's some new elements to it, but I'm pretty sure that they will continue to frame it, especially if it's a digital aspects that will be good for China's partners, maybe even leapfrogging certain developmental challenges. Whether that will be bought or not, and on the just on the commodity for manufacturers side, that seems to me like there should have been more criticism than there was from governments, or more vocal concern of like, well, okay, we're locked into a relationship that looks more north-south. On the industrial policy side of it, well, if China's moving in this more statist directions, it's got more resources, a bigger domestic economy, it's got so many more ways in which its own industrial strategy may pose a challenge to the development of developing countries, but I don't think we're going to see a lot of criticism of that. Where the BRI and AIIB fit, I think the BRI certainly has been Xi Jinping's signature policy, and in a lot of ways has been, it's been a sort of cover for China's developmentalist framework under Xi Jinping's guidance, and it's been a bit freewheeling and a lot of problems, whereas the AIIB has had a lot more sort of effort to try to make it stand up to international standards. So we'll see. If I don't expect the BRI to become sort of more reined in the same way AIB has been.
And as you say, China facing some of the blowback of being essentially neo-colonialist, right? This is the kind of criticism the West used to take when it played more of that role. Any questions in the room before I go to the ones Zoom? Yeah.
Hi there. Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Nick Foster. I actually work for USAID, and I wanted to. My question is mainly your ideas on what BRI 2.0 is going to look like. But I do want to make a couple of comments before that. One is that I think it would be interesting to maybe explain developmentalism a little more, because to me, when I look at the origin story of BRI, I see massive capital lying around, and basically the Chinese government telling its banks and its governmental agencies to go out and make some money. And that's what the principle of, in my understanding of the origin was. So is when you talk about developmentalism, is it basically its own developmentalism? Because I think that was maybe more of a priority here than helping other countries develop. The question about BRI 2.0, if we look at, there's less money going out of China now. You know, it used to be about 80 billion a year, now it's down to like 60. In 2010, 5% of all countries China was doing business with were in debt distress. Now it's 60. So we're looking at less money going out and less of a demand signal. So, and obviously, you know, China has a public relations problem, to say the least, around BRI because of, you know, the port you mentioned, which is not really representative, I think, but still is a big PR disaster, if anything. So how is China pivoting in its model? Is it because we're hearing things like China moving into syndication, doing more with other countries, with other organizations, packaging things, de-risking, etc. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
I'll take a first crack at it. I think you're exactly right, and part of what I was trying to say is this developmentalism certainly precedes the BRI, and that the domestic and the international components, absolutely from a purely pragmatic point of view, it's like more business for Chinese firms. And if you have capital, and if your firms are interested in going out, and you've and I think maybe on the infrastructure side of it, okay, we built up the infrastructure domestically, so now we've got these capacities, skills, but also, you know, sort of more extra steel on our hands and that sort of thing to be able to then go out. And then they just sell it as, well, it's good for us, it's good for you. So they've never, I don't think, seen a discrepancy between that. And I think when you know, certainly there's a rhetorical and propaganda element of this, but if they're just saying, well, okay, we'll call it development, or we'll call it BRI, but we're just here, you know, doing a deal. And so there's just a lot of deal making, and I don't see most Chinese officials or business people, you know, they wouldn't have any problem with that at all. They wouldn't skip a beat going from like, we'll call it development or BRI, but really it's just a deal, and let's see how it goes. So there's clearly an element there where that's just evolved from like going out to then this period where there wasn't really a name on it during the commodity boom era, and then the BRI. And I never quite understood why they needed to name the BRI unless it's a vanity project for Xi Jinping, if it's like an organizational, structural, bureaucratic issue, but it created so many problems, it created a target to criticize. I never quite understood why that was. And maybe 2.0 backs away from that a little bit. Maybe the Global Development Initiative backs away from that as sort of a target a bit. And just my take on where things will go, clearly official, you know, the policy bank finance has trailed off dramatically, but other commercial lending had picked up, and then COVID is this weird sort of black hole, what's going on, what's going to happen. But I think environment, green tech will be a big part of it, and they'll say that, you know, coal-fired power plants are no longer part of it, but now we'll provide other technologies or electric vehicles or, you know, power grids, all kinds of things like that will become part of it, and then the digital side of it, and I don't know exactly where that'll look, if that's fintech or other things in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, but basically elements of China's own economy that it's been developing and that it's got capacities in, it will promote those as parts of, you know, new developmental priorities that may get the BRI label.
Excellent presentations. Thank you. Michael Keyes from the Kennan Institute. I'm a State Department detailee here. I guess the one thing I didn't hear, which I'm curious from either or both of you is the issue of using, sort of why they're doing this developmental work. And where I'm going with this is maybe elite capture, right? Kind of indebting elites in these smaller countries with broader aims, like in the foreign policy area, for instance, getting those countries to support them in the UN on the issue of Taiwan and things like that. So I'd welcome your comments on that.
That's a great question. I think you are. I think there are multiple things to it. I think a big thing is wanting to approach it from like an elite point of view and wanting to kind of create these trade partnerships through this developmental approach, and only because I've looked at Sri Lanka in particular and looked at how they vote in the UN, and they vote very closely with China. And that has been a trend ever since China has entered the donor scene and has been the most prominent donor in Sri Lanka. So I think your hunch is probably right. I can't say definitively whether this is the approach because I haven't looked at how other countries were like. I know Pakistan is very similar. Also, vote very closely to China as well on UN issues. So. Yeah, that'll be my comment on that.
Just a quick comment on this on say Venezuela. I mean, I think the one thing that we almost always need to take seriously, including in the Sri Lanka case, is like what are those leaders of those other countries doing? They're fully aware of what they're doing, engaging with China. So Hugo Chavez, he was playing a game. Viktor Orban plays a game. I mean, in their own political and economic interests, and the Chinese side has its interests in those, and they'll say, well, the diplomatic and the commercial elements. Again, in the Venezuela case, they said, well, they've got the world's biggest oil reserves in Venezuela. We have the largest oil imports. That's a no-brainer. And if we can have a sort of diplomatic ally in the region, great. That blew up in their face, or at least has become a very big problem for both sides. So even attempted efforts at elite capture, first of all, have to, like, they play into and they require the Chinese side to understand the domestic politics and economics of other countries, which has been a problem.
And then, of course, they can play the game that Taiwan is not a salient issue for most of these countries. So, yeah, cheap, right? Give China what it wants and get something in return. And then there are others where there are natural alignments of interest, cover on human rights issues and things like that. So I think it varies across issue areas. So one thing from the chat that I want to put in here follows on Nara's last response, which is, the question is, in terms of Pakistan, China does not place conditionality on how CPEC benefits get shared among marginalized peoples. This enables Punjab, which produces ruling class military generals in Pakistan, to keep many of the benefits. Do you see a parallel there to Sri Lanka?
Very short answer is yes.
All right, next question.
I'm not an expert on Pakistan whatsoever, but my from what I can what I've gathered from reading the news and so on, that does seem to be. There are some parallels that are happening with that for sure. Yeah.
And then I'll get back to the room in 1 second, but I have another one from the chat, more on the security side, that says China is seeking to expand its military connections with Central Asian republics. Do you think this would help China extend is the BRI expansion west bundled with this, in effect? Will China amend its investment policy to make it appealing for nations that are concerned about predatory risks?
I think there'll be an effort to try to distinguish the sort of more purely commercial trade infrastructure kind of deals from any military elements. That doesn't mean that can't creep in. There's obviously lots of dual use concerns related to port facilities. But then this is also sort of the behavior of smaller actors. So there may be a large port facility or special economic zone that gets built, and this is where the informality that I was talking about before, lots of different actors can then sweep in and do things, maybe like arms sales in in that area. Maybe inclusion with local Chinese officials, but probably not orchestrated out of Beijing. So this is where it gets extremely complicated.
All right, another question. Yeah.
Okay, I'm visiting scholar of the George Washington University. I'm from South Korea. I'm a professor at the in South Korea, and according to your presentation, it's very excellent. But we need to take a note that China now are utilizing the public diplomacy to gain people's mind of partner states very long term. So it's kind of a the threat to the Western countries, right? So we need to focus on that question, right? It's a very important part. So what do you think of that? Yeah, my opinion.
That's I think that is. Maybe it's something to worry about. I'm not 100% sure if it is something to worry about, but it is true that this public diplomacy has changed the public's opinions about how they view China, how they view the U.S. From my understanding, where the history with China has been longer, this pattern is changing. So initially, for instance, in newer places where China is entering, like Africa and Latin America and so on, the opinions about China is still very positive. Whereas in not necessarily Sri Lanka and Pakistan, I think those are special cases, but in East Asia and so on, where they have had a longer history, the public's opinion about China is very recently starting to decrease. So I'm unsure whether it's something that we should worry about a lot or worry about just a little bit and see how it pans out as history unfolds itself.
I think this is our public diplomacy problem. I think the U.S., the EU, for example, have larger accumulations of, or in any given year, of foreign direct investment in ASEAN. Is that understood in the sort of public view? It's like, oh no, the BRI must be bigger, or China's role must be bigger. No, it gets complicated because you have Hong Kong and Singapore and other areas for that finance to go through. But there's a lot of ways in which U.S. Or Europe or Japan or South Korea are already major actors, but somehow China gets the press. So maybe this is the job of public diplomacy from other countries, including G7 cooperation on alternatives to the BRI. We get new acronyms every few months related to these. The U.S. in Jake Sullivan's recent speech, it seems to me that the commitment to sort of providing finance in developing country regions was the last on the list of priorities. So that kind of messaging, it seems to me, will also be received in the regions and countries where supposedly the U.S., Europe, and other countries are trying to compete. And so I think there can be a different messaging maybe as part of that, and maybe not worrying so much about what China's saying.
So Matt, in your paper, didn't come through as much in your presentation. There's a bit about how Southeast Asia looks different from Latin America and Africa. Would you expand on that a little bit?
This is tricky. So this goes back to like Bandung era, so 1950s Chinese diplomacy. China has wanted to be the leader and of the third world in the past. That's the way it framed it. So this goes back a long way. This developmentalism is part of this, and that always included Asia, Africa, in particular. I mean, there was parts of the Middle East, but obviously places like Indonesia and Egypt were key back then. So Asia writ large, Africa post-colonial regions. Latin America never featured all that much at that point, but the legacy now is like China's revived this effort to be an agent and leader of what it usually refers to as the developing world. We hear about this as the global south now. So there's a key element of this, but Southeast Asia is weird for China in this sense. If Asia used to be a key part of it, now Africa and Latin America or South America it seems to me they fit better into China's developmentalist mode because of the commodities, because of the willingness of leaders in large parts of Africa and Latin America to go along with this idea of South-South development or to join BRICS, to be critical of the United States, whereas Southeast Asia is far more difficult. The sort of the historical, the regional, the border issues, the deep interdependence and interconnectedness of the people of China and of Southeast Asia just makes it very complicated, and I don't see China being able to or willing to easily slot Southeast Asia into the developing world's global South area, in part also because the region is so diverse and has done so well in its own economic development, obviously with a lot of countries that don't fit. So Southeast Asia is a tricky one.
That sort of dovetails the question in the chat, which is, could you speak to the relative importance or the shifting mix between the commodity investment by China and the actual investing in manufacturing and other things in target countries, partner countries?
That's a great question. I mean, I think the commodities have continued to be really important. Some of them have changed. Some of them are the same. I mean, China still needs energy, still needs agricultural commodities. Maybe some of the mining materials are changing. Lithium, obviously, really important now, but I mean, it's not just China. So some of those commodity elements are still going to be important. Maybe some of the commodities will change, but some of just sort of the regions where those are will change. Others may know quite a bit more about sort of where China is actually committing funds to, say, manufacturing capacity in other regions. Now, this was always on the agenda. Again, if I think of discussions in Lula's first terms as president in Brazil, there were discussions about how China could benefit with more technology transfer to places like Brazil or Latin America, but they weren't doing it. There was a desire for some of that transfer of skills and technology in Africa, manufacturing capacity. I just don't know how that balance is going to look. China will certainly play up the fact that it is doing this. I don't know if that is actually happening, but I'm sure there's others doing research on this.
Hi, thanks. Great presentation. I'm Francisco Cordines, a fellow here and a professor of political science in Chile. I wanted to ask you both, what do you think are the main challenges for the Belt and Road Initiative in the next years? How do you see this project evolving and changing in target countries? I'm very curious to hear both of your opinions on that.
That's a great question. I think our U.S. aid person that was here earlier alluded to some of this. Also, the repayments are going to be a big. I think that's going to be a big challenge, and that might be a BRI 2.0 scenario. I think another challenge is for China to figure out how to be able to deliver their big infrastructural projects as fast as they are doing, but still being able to do environmental impact evaluations, which they have not been focusing on as much as of now. But it's because we're seeing their projects falling apart and having large impacts on the environments, maybe disproportionately to other donors' projects. I think these are some of the challenges that they're going to have with BRI in the coming years.
Just a quick comment, and maybe in the Latin America context of, does it have any relevance at all? Like, do you need the BRI? Is it just a bunch of MOUs? You know, the region was a latecomer to it. What's the point? I mean, does anyone benefit from it other than sort of politicians who are signing agreements? I think there's real projects. I think like Pakistan is the place I would think has got maybe more real, or whatever that means, BRI projects than other places, and then you get further and further away, and what is it other than just a rhetorical device? And from the point of view of countries in, say, Latin America, like, what is it that they really want in terms of development cooperation? What are the kinds of outcomes that would really benefit the region, and does the BRI allow them to achieve some of those aims, or is it just a cover? Will there be any kind of backlash, or is it a point of negotiation for countries to say, okay, now we've got this platform, but let's really make it worth our while?
There's another question in the chat that sort of relates to this, which is, what happens if we see more hambantotas? That is, what happens as more of these projects don't pan out economically? You don't have to buy debt trap diplomacy as a strategy, but you do have projects that are not going to be economically viable and they're going to be huge debt. How big a threat is that to BRI? How do you think China is likely to react? What's the smart play in terms of how to react?
That's a tough question. Yeah, that's a very tough question. I mean, what we are seeing is that China is giving some emergency loans to some of these countries. It's a bit under the radar still. They are aware that they have invested in countries that are high risk, and they're aware that some of these countries are not able to pay back the way that they were supposed to pay back. And instead of China losing out a lot of money from the paybacks, they're now trying to do these emergency lending policies. And that might be their only tool to figure this out. Yeah, that's my best guess.
I think there will be, though, and we may not hear about them all. What I'm waiting to see is if there is a case of like some major scandal on the Chinese side at some point because of some of these projects in the background. I always thought that maybe the China Development Bank, for its 60 billion plus in loans to Venezuela, would be called out, individuals or the bank itself held up as an example of, okay, these were mistakes that were made. They were motivated by greed, by misunderstanding, and maybe some sort of a fallout on the Chinese side. You never know, but I think there will be more of these cases, and maybe at some point that becomes a problem for certain institutions or individuals in China itself.
Yeah, the Xi Jinping regime certainly has not been shy about going after fairly high-ranking people for corruption scandals. Yeah.
Hello, I am Prathit Mishra. I study at Georgetown University. My question was, with the number of countries defaulting after the COVID crisis with BRI loans, what do you think will be China's approach? I think it would be a similar question to those you have answered. Whether it would be like a country-to-country approach, regional approach, saving some countries from default, which make more strategic sense, or would there be like similar elements across the board in the solution that would come out of it? And also with BRI2 having some strings attached and learning from BRI1, what would be the demand from these developing countries, especially because the attractiveness was that most of the loans or the aid came with no strings attached? Thank you.
Just very briefly, I mean, this is what we're already seeing the very difficult discussions going on with China and the IMF, for example, about how to structure loan defaults and who's going to get prioritized, and how do you make sure that the money from the international financial institutions doesn't just get funneled directly to China. So, I mean, I think this is what we're going to see over the next few years, of some of these very difficult discussions, but there's, I think, a big motivation on all sides to try to find some sort of an outcome. And more, I think China is going to see itself as one of the countries that faces similar problems that other lenders have in the past. There'll probably be an effort to learn a little bit about how to make sure this doesn't happen, but also probably a lot of bargaining, very difficult bargaining over who's really going to have to take a haircut on some of these loans.
So I'm Peter Susskind, fellow at the Wilson Center here. I have a question for Matt. You said earlier that the label of the BRI is counterproductive because it focuses attention and allows for a target for Western criticism. But later you said that publics and nations in Southeast Asia overestimate the scale of Chinese investment relative to Western investment. Could that not be another side of the branding coin, that this draws attention both positive and negative? So where do you think the weight is more substantial? And then the final part, you said that American and Western public diplomacy is lacking, and there does seem to be an effort now perhaps to use branding of our own, acronyms, alternatives to BRI as a solution. So would that be productive or counterproductive in your estimation? Thanks.
Oh, that's great. Well, that kind of synthesizes the whole point of my piece, I guess, is that China's committed to this thing. It's full of problems, but it's also got an appeal. I was telling Jacques I would try to talk more about the appeal or resonance side of it, because it really is a mixed bag. And so you may have a target on your back, but it's also a way for China to trumpet its developmentalism. And if you take that from the host country side of it, it basically just means more deals. And some of those deals shouldn't be done, or they're politically motivated, or they create more problems than they solve. But China forges ahead anyway. So I think we're just going to continue to see that mix. What does it mean? Yeah, it's a great question. I was telling Jacques earlier, I mean, I end the paper by saying I think the U.S. needs a clear and powerful vision of well-being in the world. And I think the developmentalism part of it is China's offer for all of its flaws. But I'm also hesitant because I don't know if we go back to the developmentalist decade of JFK in the 60s, that came with lots of problems as well. So I'm a bit torn by whether or not the U.S. should come up with its clear and forceful message to counter the BRI, or if it should just continue to try to solve problems and do what it can by offering real alternatives that are in tune with what countries really need in terms of their development.
That ties in another question in the chat, which is, in view of China's lending practices and the appeal, investment practices and the appeal they have, what can multilateral institutions or Western countries do to make their own provision of capital in investment form or aid more appealing, short of simply giving up any attempt for conditionality and influence?
Great question. That's a very good question. I think what is appealing, besides no conditional or very few conditionalities to Chinese aid, is also the speed at which they're able to deliver. They're able to, for elite, for governments and so on who are trying to stay in power or hold their promises to their constituents, China is able to help them do exactly what they tell that they want to do for their people. And maybe there is a space for Western donors to figure that out. How can they deliver the same kind of products as fast or faster as China is able to do, but maintain the quality at which they're doing it now, which is, I think, is challenging. I'm unsure what that looks like, but that's my best guess on that.
I guess I think it's going to become very specific to issues. So like on environment and sort of green tech, what is it that sort of the U.S., Europeans, others are going to be able to provide as part of their packages of alternatives to the BRI in terms of financing and technology? There's a lot of discussion of public-private cooperation, and the Europeans love to talk about, funds will be mobilized, 300 billion will be mobilized for their new initiative. And what is that actually going to mean? That's got to mean something, again, for countries that if they're going to move away from coal-fired power plants, what is the financing and technology that's available, viable, that's actually going to be used? I think it's going to come down to those very practical questions in a lot of ways.
So Matt, you've spoken to a couple of things here. One is the attempt to sort of rebrand the BRI 2.0, and the green BRI and all that stuff. And you've talked about not terribly transparent write-downs of some bad investments. But China's not part of the Paris Club. It hasn't been terribly forthcoming in being willing to take the kinds of hits and essentially give the aid that's implicit in that that Western lenders have been. So how do you see that playing out? How big a problem is that for China? Do you see its position shifting on that? That's a question for both of you.
There's been this responsiveness to criticism. I mean, there's usually initially a backlash. China will say, well, we don't have problems with the environmental problems aren't what you make of them, or the debt problems aren't what you make of them. And then there will be a response down the road after probably some discussions and ways of framing it and saying, well, we're going to be committed to a green BRI, or we're going to be committed to sort of sustainable debt propositions or sustainable lending. So I think there is still some power to some of these criticisms, but I think the more that the sort of critiques are less like the debt trap diplomacy side of things, which were too easily debunked, and saying instead, look, this is not in your interest, China, to have these loans and other deals go belly up. I think that's where the sort of leverage can be, and this is what I always tried to do in my discussions of, say, China, Venezuela, like, look, China, you're not getting the things you said you wanted. You're not getting the oil, you're not getting the close political partnership, instead you have liabilities. So to me, that's the way to get any movement on the Chinese side to be more responsible with some of these sort of, getting out of the debt situations.
Explain why it's a win-win. That was a comment to Matt, sort of playing Chinese rhetoric there, but no, your response to the broader question.
I'll try to. I'll do it briefly. I suspect that this new development of syndicated loans is a step towards working closer with DAC donors and Paris Club in syndicated loans. Because they're not the ones taking on all the risk, it will be spread out amongst multiple people. That might be their way of staying outside of the Paris Club and the whole DAC membership, and still not take a big haircut on their loans and so on. So that would be my guess on that.
We have another question in the chat, which is a little bit outside the scope of your presentations. Maybe you'll be able to speak to it, which is, what is the perception of BRI among Chinese people? That is that big branding, big emphasis by Xi Jinping, but you can imagine a story where this is seen as diverting resources that should be used at home and all those kinds of troubles. So do you have a sense of that?
Now I feel like everything is, I used to know this so well because I was working there day to day for, a decade at the university. But so just as an example of one of my former colleague, I mean, there was a gold rush sort of attitude in the years after the BRI was rolled out inside of China. Tons of new think tanks, everybody wanted in. So at the universities, one of my colleagues who worked on U.S. or China-Europe relations, nothing to do with most of the core elements of the BRI, he started a China BRI Strategy Institute. So there is a lot of sort of ways in which people make the BRI work for themselves. I think Yemin and Boston College has talked about this, and in her book too, about this sort of all the incentives and sort of misaligned incentives that were created in the wake of the BRI domestically to say that whatever you're doing is somehow related to the BRI. So probably a lot of excitement and sort of wasted effort. But now what has happened with COVID? Is that calmed down all of that excitement? I just don't know what's happening now inside of China with that.
Hi. Oh.
Hello? Have I got it? Oh, okay. Sorry. You mentioned the BRICS and a lot of appeal to the developing countries by the BRICS. There's other geopolitical things going on, like the Russian war in Ukraine, realliances in the Middle East, and particularly the G20 and the rise of the G20, which is hosted by India this year, which has a common framework, which I don't think has worked out very well. Can you comment on how those things might play into the development work? Thank you.
I would just like to thank the questioner for doing the obligatory mentioning Ukraine. It has to be in every, but it's a fair one. That and of course that feeds into the general discussion of is China losing the global north, winning the global south, partly as a fallout of Russia.
Yeah, well, I guess what I would say about this is, I think China's kind of, I think Lula is a big part of this. I always go back to Lula because that's the one I know the best. I mean, he was an enthusiastic contributor to the BRICS. There were always big problems with that organization. It was always so disparate. They came together, I mean, I think 2000, post-financial crisis, the timing of that worked out fairly well, but then sort of the, again, post-commodity boom, Brazil's problems, South Africa's problems, Russia's problems made that grouping difficult. Now we're sort of back in sort of a new phase, partly because of solidarity between the, China, Russia, and others who don't want to be on board with a full-out sort of critique of Russia and Ukraine. But I do think this just sort of is going to force China even more strongly to commit to this sort of developmentalist rhetoric, in the sense also of a sort of, this is the global south, this is not the US, Europe, Japan, sort of, we're the rest. But it's going to be tricky when India gets its say in this as well, because it's going to have very different views on sort of the commitments and priorities of that grouping. But China's going to absolutely continue to push forward with its efforts to be a leader of those who don't agree with what the US and Europeans are doing.
We're up against time here, but I'm going to give one of our panelists for the next session. Last question, Matt.
Right. So thank you both for your presentations. A question for Matt. So you mentioned, so this is not the BRI 2.0 question, but you mentioned there's a couple different things happening. On the one hand, in the macro picture, we have a shift towards health and digital. On the other hand, there are still these very sort of shady deals happening, and one has to, scratch their head and wonder, how does that come about? So do you see any institutional learning? So one of the things we're interested in our project is what we call the learning curve, right? So we're 10 years in the BRI. Is there a finer, more granular vetting process for these deals? MOFCOM, NDRC, chambers of commerce within particular industries or sectors? Like, what do you see there, and is that assisting the quality of the deals?
Great question, and I'm sure you know way more about this. I was interested in some of these same things as well, although not necessarily as much at the institutional level, but I think you're asking exactly the right questions. It was clear to me there was movement on this in the years, going back, even maybe preceding BRI, in the sense that all of this effort to try to do better political risk assessment was finding its way into institutions, including the China Development Bank, which didn't have that. The Export-Import Bank did, for example. MOFCOM, others at a far more granular level were sort of instituting this. But what did they mean by it? What did they understand by it? It required them to make assessments of other countries' political systems and what was sustainable, stable, or threatening or not, and that tied into like their ability to learn and understand these other systems, and that was all kind of still in the works, it seemed to me. You can institutionalize it, but then you have to like do it, and that's hard for any of us who try to understand other countries' political systems and development. So there was a commitment to it, including also the branding of more CSR kinds of work. How well they're doing on that, I don't know. What I saw was some back steps, including in the Myanmar case, where there was learning going on. There was initially sort of an effort to engage with local civil society on projects, and then it became a sort of mapping of local civil society in those places so that you could either undercut them or even play more hardball kind of tactics, especially with the military government now. So there's many ways in which that learning can take place in ways that we may not understand.
So I know we're over time here, but there's one question I wanted to throw to Nara that came in the chat, which is Afghanistan. At the C+5 summit, there was talk about China's cooperation in rebuilding Afghanistan. Does the Sri Lankan case or anything else you've worked on give any lessons for how that might pan out?
That's a good question. I suspect China is interested in wanting to be part of the rebuilding of Afghanistan, especially with the U.S. being out of that place, and it's given them the space to enter that scene. And as they're trying to do more diplomacy in these kinds of way, they just negotiated the Saudi Arabia and Iran deal. So I could see them be part of this. I don't know how that will pan out for them in terms of their own Muslim ethnic groups within China and how they will make these arguments publicly. How that will go, that I don't know.
Okay, so by way of excuse and apology, I did talk to Shihoko, and she agreed that we would crush our break to 10 minutes because 15 minutes seemed a little long, so that's why we've gone 5 minutes over. Please join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you all for your questions. And we will reconvene promptly at 10:30 when Shihoko, who is a far better chair and time management person than I am, will be in this seat. Thank you.